Good evening and welcome to What the Friday. I know we've talked about plenty of cults on past episodes, and we've even had an episode on female cult leaders, but the one we're talking about tonight has so much to it that I couldn't just sum it up in a few paragraphs. Do you remember back on December 31st, 1999, many people, and not just members of cults, thought that that would be the day the world ended? Why? Well, mainly because up until that time, computers process dates in 2 digits. Say, for instance, the year was 1971, the computer saw it as 71. So the year 2000 would become 00, which would be the same as 1900. They called it the Y2K bug. Well, when the clock struck midnight, experts thought that computers would crash, systems would go down, and the world would erupt in mass chaos. Stores were selling survival kits with non-perishable foods, and according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, over $300 million was spent worldwide upgrading and preparing computer systems. Now thinking about it, it seems kind of silly, doesn't it? I remember I even had to work that night because, just in case something happened, and where I worked at that time wasn't one of those that did the expensive computer upgrades. So, I don't know how I was going to stop it, but anyway, I was there if it happened. Now, nothing happened, and we lived to see the new millennium arrive. But there was at least one cult who had been banking on the world ending that day, and because it didn't, mass chaos ensued in their world.
Welcome to What the Friday, the After Dark series presented by Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Listening discretion is advised.
Now, the cult that I'm talking about is the movement of the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. It was created by a woman named Credonia, Mwerinde, and a man named Joseph Kibweteere, who was a former government worker, but I'm going to talk more about them in a minute. But in the late 1980s, she had claimed that she saw the Virgin Mary in a cave, and that's how this cult got its start. Now, during that time, the country of Uganda was in a lot of turmoil that ranged from political to social to religious. There was, the big AIDS epidemic going on, and then the Roman Catholic Church itself was caught up in scandals. And those that had been faithful to the church found themselves looking for, I guess you could call it a replacement. Well, along came a bunch of self-proclaimed messiahs, and they rejected the control of the government and the church. And most people who were joining the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God, they were doing it as a protest against the Roman Catholic Church. And I believe in the beginning there was probably some good intentions there, but those got lost somewhere along the way. Now, Credonia, she was a bar owner, but that bar went broke in 1989, and that's when she converted to Roman Catholicism. Around that time, she claims to have seen the Virgin Mary in a cave, so she persuaded 2 local clerics who were well known in the area to help her form her cult. Credonia was said to be this very beautiful and very persuasive woman, so it probably wasn't hard to get their help. Some even compared her, because of her past, to Mary Magdalene. For 3 years after she had seen her vision, she lived as a household member of Joseph Kibweteere. Kibweteere was the headmaster at a private boarding school, and when he converted to her beliefs, it instantly gave the cult some integrity. Now, Kibweteere was fascinated with those people who could have visions, and when Credonia told him that in her vision of Mary, she had told her that a man named Joseph Kibweteere was going to help her restore the 10 Commandments. I mean, she said his name, but of course, this was like music to his ears, and he was like just instantly blown away by it. I mean, the Virgin Mary had named him specifically, so how could he say no? Now, his family wasn't so awestruck by Credonia, though. They were convinced that the 2 of them were having an affair, and they had her thrown out. Well, in retaliation, Credonia set Joseph's wife's clothes on fire, and then she beat her up. Not long after that, Joseph moved into Credonia's compound and became the theoretical cult leader with her. Now, members of the movement lived a very strict life. They had to uphold the 10 Commandments, of course. They took place in weekly fasting, practiced sexual abstinence, and they even developed their own sign language because talking among themselves was taboo. And I mean, they couldn't even talk to the leader. So, I mean, it was pretty much sworn to a life of like silence. Now, the most devoted to the movement, they would make this pilgrimage to a rock that they believed resembled the Virgin Mary. And to get there, you would have to hike through a eucalyptus forest and climb rocks. And that was not a feat that was easily accomplished. Now, the leaders seemed to know when a member would commit the least sin and when a follower would break a rule. They said that tears of blood would be shed by the 2 female leaders. By 1997, there was an estimated 5,000 members, and the following year, the movement was shut down because of unsanitary conditions, child labor, and even possible kidnappings of children. But that wouldn't be the end of the cult because the government soon let them reopen. Now, as the millennium approached, things started getting pretty chaotic because they were all preparing for the end of the world. A newspaper published an interview with a teenage member of the movement, and he was quoted as saying, "The world ends next year. There is no time to waste. Some of our leaders talk directly to God. Any minute from now, when the end comes, every believer who will be at an as yet undisclosed spot will be saved." Now, as the new year approached, the leaders of the movement urged their followers to confess their sins so that they would be ready when the clock struck midnight. Now, physical preparations were taking place on the movement's property as well, because they started selling off their cattle and their clothing for really cheap prices. And the work that had been in the fields came to a complete stop. The compound itself kind of ran like a sharecropping type farm. But on January the 1st, 2000, when that time came and went without an apocalypse, things started falling apart there within that cult. Followers were questioning the credibility of the leaders, and the donations that they were making to the cult took a dramatic decrease. And not only that, members were asking for refunds of the money they had given the leaders from the cattle and clothing they had sold. Now, Ugandan police believe that what transpired next was arranged by the leaders to save face and as a response to the crisis they were finding themselves in. So what the leaders did next was predict a new date for the end of the world. They said that on March 17, 2000, the end of the world would happen. So March 17th came, and to welcome the end, they threw one heck of a party. They roasted 3 bulls and drank 70 crates of sodas. Not long after the members arrived at the celebration, they heard this really loud explosion. Suddenly, the building they were in, which was an old church, it was engulfed in flames. The windows and doors had been boarded up, so there was no way to escape, and all 530 people who were in attendance were killed. Entire families, including little babies, were killed. Now, can you imagine the horror of being burned alive? And I did read in a Newsweek article that said that the fireball that went through the church was so intense that their skulls literally exploded. Now, it was assumed that the leaders of the movement died in the flames with them, but it was found out that just a few days before the fire, one of the leaders was seen buying 50 liters of sulfuric acid. And it's believed at that time that they had used that to start the fire. It didn't take Ugandan officials long to discover that there was far more carnage than just at the fire. When authorities started checking other properties that were known to be used by the movement, another 395 bodies were found. Some of them had been stabbed and others were poisoned, and it's believed that they had been killed 3 weeks before the fire at the church. In all, more people died in this tragedy than died in the Jim Jones tragedy that we talked about a few weeks ago. Now, after several interviews and intense investigating, The local police realized that this was not a mass suicide, but a mass murder, and the movement's leaders were to blame. They theorized that when the members of the movement started to revolt against leadership after that first doomsday prediction was wrong, the leaders had to come up with a new plan, and that plan was to eliminate their followers. And it wasn't hard to make that guess, because during the investigation, they found that the church had been boarded up. Like the windows and the doors were, nailed shut. And they found incendiaries where they believed that was used to light the fire. But get this, the bodies of the leaders were never identified among any of the victims, and it's believed that those leaders are still alive and in hiding. Now, not only did current members of the movement perish, but it was also found out that members went house to house seeking out and urging former members to rejoin before it was too late, and many of them did. Newsweek interviewed former members and found a lot of information on Credonia. Former members said that she was this very vindictive woman, and she seemed to be obsessed with fire. They even thought that she was possibly mentally unstable. It was also found out that once people joined her cult, they were forced to sell off everything they owned and hand the money over to the cult leaders. So, I guess that theory that members were demanding their money back after the world didn't end was discredited when it was found out that the constitution of the cult that was written by Credonia actually said that the world would end by the end of the year 2000, not at the beginning or any specific date. So how did she keep the executioners of the earlier murders from being running and, snitching on her? Well, they killed them too. Their bodies were found in a latrine pit and had been partially dissolved in sulfuric acid. So maybe the acid that one of the leaders had been seen purchasing wasn't used to fuel the fire, but to get rid of evidence. All of the deaths were almost the perfect murder. If it hadn't been for that pesky smell of rotten human flesh, police might have ruled the church fire as a mass suicide instead of mass murder. That rotting flesh led them to hundreds of bodies buried in mass graves, which in turn opened the investigation into the church fire. Credonia's trail of fire and murder goes way further back than this, though. In her 20s, she set the belongings of a former lover on fire because he had dumped her. And at that time, her family sent her away for treatment, and when she returned, she told a childhood friend that she had been mentally disturbed. It's also known that she persuaded a man traveling through the area to spend some time with her, and while she was sleeping, she killed him and stole his money. Now, it's also suspected that she murdered each of her 3 brothers one by poisoning them so that she would be the sole owner of the property, which would later become the cult's headquarters. So how would she convince her closest cohorts to commit mass murder? Well, apparently she had instilled a fear of demonic intrusion into the cult in everyone involved, and then she used that to persuade them to commit the murders. And it's also thought that because she was said to black out in order to download messages from the Virgin Mary, she may have told them that Mary said that the murders were necessary to rid the cult of evil. And if the bodies of the cult leaders were never identified in any of the remains, what could have happened to them? It's believed that at least Credonia and another leader disappeared into the Congo because a search there is basically impossible. The Eastern Congo is a lawless land filled with conflicting factions. I mean, who would really want to go there to search for anyone? See, I told you there was a lot to this story. And the deeper I got into researching this episode, the more I found myself saying, well, I can't leave that part out. Well, that's it for tonight's What the Friday. Come back tomorrow morning for an all-new Weekend Weird Files.